So this is our first true podcast where we're going to be taking notes in our packet and following along with my notes here on the screen. So you're not going to really see my face or any other chemistry teachers here, mostly just this page of notes, and we're going to break it into some little chunks. We're only doing the top part of page 3, so it's not even a full page. We'll do the bottom in the next podcast. So here in just a moment, we're going to start with a few definitions that aren't written on the page, and then we're going to take a look at the definitions we already have written for you and talk about how they contribute to our experiment in this scientific method idea, and I'll give you an example that kind of relates to these words so you can understand them better. And then we're practically done. We'll just answer a couple of questions, and that last one's going to be mostly up to you, so make sure you pay attention as we start talking about qualitative and quantitative data so that you can finish that up. So, starting off, what is the scientific method? What even is science? Well, the scientific method is an organized process used by scientists to do research. So it's just a process that we go through, and the key word here really is the organized process. That word right there at the beginning is the most important part. It's a system, it's a process that we go through that helps us reliably get results that we can rely on that are true answers to our questions. Because anyone can just do stuff and call it an experiment, but by going through this scientific method process, we can get answers out that other people can replicate and that we can trust are true and correct. And all scientists in all different fields of science follow the scientific method. It might look a little different if you're in a physics lab instead of a chemistry lab, but they're still following the same experimental process. So, one of the important things to be aware of when you're designing an experiment and trying to follow the scientific method is collecting data and what types of data you're trying to collect. There's two different types, qualitative and quantitative. And if you think of the words qualities and quantities, which are kind of the root words for each of these terms and these types of data, you can kind of understand what they're talking about already. If you think of qualities that you'd like in a friend or qualities in yourself, you're probably thinking of some descriptive information about yourself, some words that you can use to describe yourself. Those are your qualities. And that's all that qualitative data is generally words describing physical characteristics like color, odor, shape, size, something that isn't numerical. Because then, of course, quantities is all about amounts. Quantitative data is going to give us numerical information that tells us how much of something we have, how big it is, how small it is, and not just saying it's small, saying it's 2 centimeters long. That is a quantity. That gives us a number that tells us about that substance or whatever that data is observing. So we'll come back to those ideas a little bit in a minute. These next few definitions are already written for you, and these 3 words here you need to kind of understand in relationship to each other. A hypothesis is often what we use as a temporary explanation, or sometimes it's even a question that helps us get started with a experiment. But that is the most temporary and unreliable explanation that we have here. If we test a hypothesis well enough, then it could become a theory that we've tested it over and over again. It's well substantiated. Other people are starting to believe our hypothesis, so it can kind of graduate into becoming a theory. But only if it is universally accepted, tested beyond just, I think this is what it is, but everyone across the world universally accepts this as true, then that can become a scientific law. Now, we're not saying here that hypotheses are bad or not true or unreliable. It's just that they're temporary. It's usually a starting point for further testing or experimentation. So it's not the ending point. And even a law is not necessarily an ending point. We can continue to study universally accepted laws even after they have become a law. Now, these next 2 words are important words for how we set up and design experiments. Every experiment should have a control, a standard that we can use to compare are changes that we're going to be making in our experiment, because all experiments involve a careful set of changes and observations that test a hypothesis or a theory. And you're probably pretty aware that experiments, we make changes and we observe them, but not everyone is really aware the idea or the necessity of having a control in an experiment. You might have heard of these before, called baselines. What we need is, if we're going to make a change, we need to make sure that the change we think we're making is having the effect that we're seeing. And this is where I think an example will help us out. So let's say that I have a hypothesis. I think that more water will help plants grow more. So I have a little plant that I've been watering, and I really want it to grow more. If all I did was start to water that plant more, then it might get bigger, but we don't know whether just over time it would have gotten bigger by itself. If maybe there's some other factors that are changing in us watering it more. Are we moving it more? Maybe those things are causing changes to the plant also. So what we need isn't just to take one plant and make a change to it. We need to have at least 2 plants, if not more, to make a better experiment. We need to keep watering that little plant that we've been starting with the same amount. And then we need another plant. And honestly, if we know we're doing this experiment from the get-go, we should start with 2 identical plants and have them in identical soil, in identical pots, on the same windowsill, getting the same amount of light. Everything should be the same about them, and that way we only make one very careful change and water one of those plants more than the other. And then, if everything else is exactly the same, even down to the same windowsill with the same amount of light from the same angle, and the one that we're watering more grows more, then we can be more confident that the water amount is what caused it to grow more. But if we don't have that control, we don't have that baseline to compare where everything else is the same, happen in both plants except for that amount of water, we don't really know whether the water is what's helping it grow more or something else. So that control is really important, because otherwise you're just doing stuff and seeing stuff happen, and you think that's what is causing these changes, but it's not necessarily the case. So, what's the function of a control in an experiment? Well, it's used to compare how changes we're making affect the experiment's objects or substances or plants. Now, this last question that we're going to end on, we started by talking about qualitative and quantitative data, and I want you to go ahead and find 2 examples of each type of data just in the room around you. It could be your bedroom, it could be your kitchen, I don't really care where it is, but I want you to be looking around you right now when you're finishing this up. Look at those definitions for qualitative and quantitative at the top of your page, and you might make like a T-chart, like qualitative, list 2 things underneath it. Quantitative, list 2 things underneath it. That would work for me. Or maybe you decide to kind of do it sideways, just list out the words like we wrote it up above, and then just have 2 examples there. But in this space, I want to see 2 examples each for each of these different types of data so that we can make sure you're on the right track in understanding those words. And that's it. We're done with this podcast. Come in if you have any questions about these words, but just bring your packet to class and get your stamp, and we'll be on our way.